He was once a devout seminary student, wearing a black robe every day, kneeling to read the Holy Bible and singing hymns in a peaceful church in Georgia. His mother wept with pride, believing her little boy would become a compassionate priest, bringing love and salvation to humanity. But history has recorded a terrifyingly grim truth: the very hands that once carefully turned the pages of sacred texts were the same cold hands that signed countless execution orders, hurting tens of millions of people to their deaths. There is a shocking contradiction that few dare to emphasize: the monster who engineered a horrific famine that drove people to cannibalism, the man who built the bloody Gulag concentration camp system that drained the life out of his own countrymen, was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize twice. Half the world hailed him as the great savior who crushed Hitler's war machine. The other half cursed him as the ultimate incarnation of evil, the most bloodthirsty butcher of the 20th century, whose brutality far exceeded even what the fascists dared to do. How did an apprentice of God mutate into the man of steel, with a frozen heart devoid of any humanity? Where is the line between a liberating hero and a mass-murdering, paranoid dictator? The truth about Joseph Stalin is not found in textbook stereotypes or grandiose monuments. It lies buried deep beneath the blood-stained ice of Siberia, inside the death-wreaking execution basements of the Lubyanka, and within the violently abusive childhood that nurtured a monster. Fists reeking of cheap alcohol smashed directly into the face of a scrawny child, crushing his tiny lips into a bloody pulp. Fresh blood violently gushed from the boy's nose, dripping down onto the filthy dirt floor of a squalid hovel in Gori. The man throwing these brutal punches was Bessarion, his own biological father. The man was a deranged alcoholic who constantly unleashed his bitter life frustrations onto the bruised flesh of his wife and young son. Savage beatings with heavy leather belts that tore open skin, and violent kicks that fractured his ribcage, were the only fundamental lessons little Ioseb ever received. The boy did not cry or beg for mercy. He lay tightly curled up in a slimy pool of his own blood, his pitch-black eyes staring intensely at the panting monster standing above him. He learned the absolute rule of physical survival: whoever holds superior power possesses the right to inflict excruciating pain, and the weak are merely meat sacks meant for absorbing rage. Love was a completely laughable delusion. Only extreme, unchecked brutality could guarantee total submission. Fate continued to carve up the boy's flesh with its most horrific physical claws. The deadly smallpox virus swept through his system, transforming his face into a bleeding battlefield of ruptured pustules. Deep, infected ulcers ravaged his epidermis, leaving behind a hideous network of permanent, crater-like pockmarks firmly nailed into his facial skin. Further physical destruction struck when a horse-drawn carriage completely crushed his left arm, splintering the bones and leaving the limb permanently withered and deformed. Growing up with a crippled body and a deeply scarred face, he became the frequent target of pathetic mockery. Those fools had absolutely no idea that every single pockmark on his face, and every deep marrow ache from his crippled arm, was pouring raw phosphorus onto his boiling fire of hatred. The world had physically tortured him. Now, he was going to torture the entire world with millions of corpses. The Tsarist government hurled him into damp, pitch-black prisons crawling with typhus-infected lice, before banishing him to the freezing tundras of Siberia. Amidst the flesh-cutting cold of -50 degrees, where robust men violently coughed up pools of black blood and froze to death into grotesque ice statues, he found his perfectly natural habitat. The suffocating white death surrounding him did not break his will. The merciless Siberian ice completely froze over the last remaining fragment of humanity left in his soul. He became deeply, incurably paranoid, entirely willing to stab his own comrades in the back just to secure a piece of moldy bread. At the edge of life and death, he forged himself into an apex predator devoid of any moral concepts. As he silently boarded the rusting cargo train leaving the Siberian wasteland, his worn leather boots stomped directly onto the frozen hand of a dead prisoner lying on the icy platform. The sickening crack of snapping finger bones echoed sharply beneath his heavy heel. He did not look down. He casually spat a wad of bloody saliva onto the pristine white snow. His withered left arm remained hidden inside a foul-smelling trench coat, while his right hand slowly stroked the freezing iron grip of a revolver tucked under his belt. A pack of starving wolves was already ripping apart the frozen corpses behind him, aggressively gnawing on the frozen marrow. He merely smirked, exposing a row of decaying, yellow teeth, and violently slammed the heavy iron door of the train car shut. The Russian Empire had absolutely no idea that its most bloodthirsty monster had just been completely unchained. The freezing, pitch-black waters of the Volga River violently slammed against the sides of a rotting wooden barge, kicking up a thick stench of mold and putrefying decay. Dozens of former Tsarist military officers, men who once proudly puffed their chests adorned with shining gold medals, were now stripped entirely of their warm clothing. Their hands were violently bent backward and bound tight by heavy, rusted iron chains. The razor-sharp bayonets of cold-blooded Cheka soldiers jabbed directly into their exposed ribs, violently forcing them to drag their feet across the slippery, dew-soaked wooden deck. Deep gashes in their flesh oozed thick streams of dark blood, dripping down onto their bare feet severely bruised by the jagged mud. The metallic clanking of heavy iron chains fused seamlessly with the terrifying sounds of violently torn, hacking coughs. These bleeding men were not being deployed to a battlefield to fight. They were being violently herded directly into a massive, floating wooden coffin adrift on the raging river current. Standing tall like a gargoyle on the fog-choked riverbank, draped in a filthy, mud-splattered military greatcoat, was Iosif, now calling himself Stalin. Vladimir Lenin had specifically dispatched him to the city of Tsaritsyn with one mission, to aggressively confiscate wheat to feed the starving Red Army. But the man utterly despised the wheat. He smelled fresh, warm blood, and he desperately wanted to sink his teeth in to taste the absolute power of life and death. To him, these captured professional military officers were not valuable human resources or prisoners to be interrogated. They were strictly garbage, merely soft barricades made of human meat that needed to be instantly exterminated so he could establish his own brutal kingdom of absolute terror. There were no juries. There were no pathetic, prolonged courtroom trials. There was only a razor-cold stare emanating from his pockmarked face and a ruthlessly subtle upward flick of his chin to terminate their lives. Rusted iron gears shrieked with an ear-piercing grind as the massive wooden barge was aggressively towed out into the deepest, most freezing currents of the Volga River. Not a single precious bullet was permitted to be wasted on these prisoners. Instead, soldiers wielded heavy steel axes to brutally smash massive holes directly through the bottom planks of the hull. The freezing, pitch-black river water instantly violently surged upward, furiously swallowing the hollow wooden cavern. Extreme, pure terror detonated inside the barge. Utterly desperate, throat-shredding screams violently ripped through the dead silence of the night. Dozens of chained men frantically thrashed in absolute panic, violently clawing their raw fingertips against the wooden floorboards until their fingernails ripped completely off, smearing fresh, bright crimson blood across the soaked wood. The muddy water violently flooded into their windpipes, ruthlessly strangling their final agonizing screams into pathetic, suffocating gurgles. The freezing water instantly crushed their lungs, aggressively dragging dozens of souls down into the bottomless muddy abyss in horrifying, violent convulsions. Standing safely on the muddy shore, Stalin did not blink a single time. He stood entirely motionless like a statue cast from rusted iron ore, deeply inhaling the air heavily thick with the brutal stench of mass death. He closed his eyes, intensely listening to the gruesome symphony of mass drowning with an extreme, sickening sense of total satisfaction. Only when the final bloody air bubbles breached the water's surface and violently popped, leaving the flattened Volga River to swallow its disgusting secret, did he finally turn on his heel. His heavy military leather boots violently crushed the mud puddles mixed with the fresh blood and saliva of the doomed prisoners. He silently marched straight back to his headquarters, violently kicked open the door to his heated room, drew his steel dagger, and casually tore off a massive chunk of greasy roasted meat, chewing it voraciously. He completely ignored the mutilated corpses slowly bloating under the intense water pressure at the bottom of the dark river. Blood had finally stained his lips, and his insatiable hunger for human meat had only just truly begun. Lenin's carefully frozen corpse lay entirely desolate inside the blazing red marble mausoleum in Red Square, but the hot, fresh blood of his political enemies was already violently pouring down the marble power corridors of the Kremlin. Lenin's demise blew open a colossal power vacuum, and Iosif Jugashvili, now officially bearing the terrifying title of Stalin, the Man of Steel, did not utilize bullets or fiery, passionate speeches to climb to the absolute peak of supreme glory. Instead, he utilized thick, black venom distilled straight from the pitch-dark shadows. Those arrogant elites who had once publicly mocked him as a crude, paper-pushing desk clerk, an uneducated cobbler's son stained with Georgian mud, now violently tasted the bitter, metallic flavor of his ruthless revenge. Leon Trotsky, the glorious founding hero of the Red Army, the man who had constantly looked down on him with sheer intellectual contempt, was entirely stripped of all political power and violently kicked out of the country like a diseased stray dog carrying severe tuberculosis. This relentless hunt culminated years later when a razor-sharp ice axe was brutally buried deep into Trotsky's skull in his study, violently spraying his brain matter and hot blood across his pristine white papers. Stalin was never in a rush. The brutal Game of Thrones was, to him, the macabre art of slow, meticulous murder. He stood completely hidden in the darkest, dampest corners of the Kremlin, deeply inhaling the pungent smoke from his pipe, smiling a deeply sinister, yellow-toothed grin as he actively let his own high-ranking comrades viciously tear each other apart like a pack of starving, rabid dogs viciously fighting over a maggot-infested bone. He acted exactly like a massive, venomous spider, slowly and deliberately spinning invisible webs coated in bloody mucus, ruthlessly wrapping them tightly around every single living member of the Politburo. By the time intellectual giants like Zinoviev and Kamenev realized a razor-sharp blade was already pressing tightly against their vocal cords, it was entirely too late. Stalin had already seized total, absolute control of the most ruthless secret police apparatus, transforming every single state administrative agency into his own personal guillotine designed to feed his endless thirst for human flesh. His brutal escalation to supreme power was not accompanied by the grandiose roar of artillery cannons on a battlefield, but rather by the bone-chilling, dry, metallic knocks echoing on heavy wooden doors at exactly 3 in the morning. Death warrants that violently stripped the lives of tens of thousands of individuals were casually, emotionlessly signed by him using his worn-out, thick red and blue wax pencil. He did this as blandly and systematically as a slaughterhouse butcher crossing off the daily quota of cattle meant for the meat grinder. He ruthlessly slaughtered the entire first generation of the revolution, the very brave men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the freezing, muddy trenches. Their fresh, hot blood poured in torrents, soaking deeply into the brick crevices of the suffocating, damp underground torture basements of the Lubyanka prison. The executioners systematically flayed the skin off their heels and violently shattered their ribs one by one until they were physically broken enough to sign the most absurd, fabricated confessions imaginable. But Stalin did not merely stop at physically piercing their beating hearts. He sadistically wanted to strip away their very existence from the physical flow of time. The names of these founding fathers were literally burned away with acid from all historical archives, and their faces were violently scraped off and painted black in every single surviving photograph. For this absolute monster, true supreme power was not about being worshipped by adoring masses or building grandiose temples. Absolute power was the terrifying ability to violently snap any human soul in half. It was the extreme, spine-tingling euphoric rush of watching the most arrogant, powerful men violently drop to their knees, desperately begging for a quick bullet to the head while soaking in a pool of their own terrified urine. His master manipulation violently transformed the vast expanses of the Russian Empire into a colossal, pitch-black slaughterhouse, where he alone possessed the sole, exclusive right to breathe air that did not violently reek of decomposing, rotting corpses. The incredibly fertile black soil of Ukraine was once the vast breadbasket that fed the entire old continent, but under Stalin's iron, blood-soaked hands, it was violently transformed into a colossal, horrifying graveyard reeking of unimaginable mass death. His brutal agricultural collectivization plan was never genuinely an economic policy, it was a meticulously calculated, collective death warrant explicitly designed to completely physically exterminate any peasants who dared to resist his supreme rule. His heavily armed, ruthless henchmen swarmed the countryside like a plague of starving, demonic locusts. They used the heavy steel butts of their rifles to smash down doors, violently stabbing their bayonets through wooden walls and floors to hunt down every single hidden grain of wheat. They ruthlessly plundered absolutely everything that could possibly be digested, from rotting potatoes buried deep in underground cellars to bags of flour hidden inside haystacks, stripping away diseased livestock and brutally confiscating even the critical seed grain meant for the next harvest. Anyone caught hiding even a pathetic handful of wheat was instantly gunned down on the spot, their brain matter violently splattering across their family's own empty grain silos. The Holodomor famine crashed down upon the land like a massive, invisible monster, using its brutal claws to sadistically rip away every ounce of muscle and fat from the bodies of millions. Once thriving, bustling villages were completely submerged in the deafening, rotting silence of the absolute dead. People physically lost the energy to even cry. The stomachs of young children ballooned and stretched tight like massive, grotesque water balloons, while their limbs withered away into brittle, grayish skeletal twigs. Their eyes sank violently deep into pitch-black hollow craters, staring blankly at their milk-depleted mothers who furiously clawed at the frozen, unforgiving ground to chew on dry tree roots, rough bark, and literal mud in a desperate, pathetic attempt to sustain life. Their internal organs were aggressively shredded by digesting inedible filth, forcing them to violently vomit up pools of thick, black blood. When the toxic weeds and rotting rat carcasses finally ran out, the most primal, terrifying survival instinct awakened the true, horrific monster lurking inside human nature, outright cannibalism. Inside those suffocating, pitch-black hovels reeking intensely of decomposing flesh, the most disgusting, unspeakable nightmares became a shocking, tangible reality. Eyes driven completely insane by extreme, mind-shattering starvation began glaring directly at freshly deceased corpses. Filthy, soil-caked fingernails violently tore off raw chunks of pale human flesh to strip away whatever meager muscle tissue remained on the bones. History itself is forced to look away in sheer horror as completely deranged parents used heavy iron hammers to violently crush the fragile skulls of their youngest, weakest infants, butchering them for meat and shedding tears of pure blood right into the thick, boiling human stew. Fresh human blood continuously oozed from between their filthy teeth, violently transforming them into mindless, living zombies wandering aimlessly across a permanently cursed wasteland. Endless columns of wooden carts, piled dangerously high with completely shriveled corpses that resembled dried firewood, aggressively dumped their loads directly into shallow mass graves, where millions of blowflies aggressively laid eggs directly inside the open, empty eye sockets of the doomed victims. Standing perfectly safe inside the heavily fortified Kremlin thousands of miles away, Stalin never physically saw a single drop of this blood, he merely viewed abstract numbers printed on dry paper. Gruesome reports detailing millions of agonizing starvation deaths were neatly placed on his massive oak desk. He casually stroked his thick mustache, slowly lifting a crystal glass of sweet Georgian wine, glistening bright crimson just like fresh blood squeezed from ripe grapes, and smirked with utter, chilling indifference. To him, this catastrophic famine was never a tragic disaster to be solved, but a meticulously flawless tool of total extermination. It was the ultimate, inescapable prison built entirely without walls or armed guards. He successfully utilized the agonizing torture of an empty stomach to completely snap the collective spine of a fiercely proud nation. Over 7 million human souls were aggressively crushed into bloody mud, becoming nothing more than dark, blood-soaked fertilizer for the terrifyingly brutal empire of a pure demon wearing human skin. If the brutal famine was a massive scythe blindly sweeping across the peasant fields, the Great Terror of 1937 was a meticulously sharpened surgical scalpel violently stabbed directly into the throat of the nation's elite. Stalin successfully transformed his extreme, deranged paranoia into the most brutally bloody theatrical performance in history, acting simultaneously as the sadistic director and the absolute executioner. Russia was entirely submerged in an atmosphere of thick, paralyzing terror, so dense that people could literally smell the putrid stench of raw betrayal aggressively oozing from every human pore. Stalin's master manipulation reached demonic levels. He did not merely murder people, he mentally tortured them into exposing one another, violently forcing them to completely chew up their own dignity before being violently hurled into the mechanized meat grinder. Innocent children were deeply brainwashed to joyfully point the finger of death at their own parents. Neighbors viciously stalked one another, pressing their ears tightly against paper-thin walls to catch even a slightly dissenting whisper. Just one insufficient gaze of absolute worship, a careless drunken joke, or even the accidental wrapping of greasy sausage in a newspaper bearing the supreme leader's image, was entirely enough for the pitch-black police vans, terrifyingly known as the Black Ravens to screech to a halt outside their doors at the stroke of midnight. Deep inside the suffocating, soundproof torture basements of the Lubyanka building, the fresh blood completely failed to ever dry. The ruthless secret police butchers were heavily equipped with steel-cored rubber truncheons, heavy iron pliers, and raw electrical wires, ready to brutally choke out any savage screams of unbearable agony. Glorious military generals who once commanded tens of thousands of troops, brilliant scientific minds, and delicate poets with soft hands, all were aggressively hung upside down from the damp ceiling, stripped completely naked, and mercilessly beaten until their skin was violently ripped wide open and their internal organs were crushed to pulp. They were aggressively deprived of sleep for weeks on end, completely blinded by massive high-voltage interrogator lights glaring directly into their bloodshot, oozing eye sockets until their fragile human minds violently shattered into pathetic, disjointed fragments. Stalin thoroughly understood the inherent weakness of human flesh. Enough brutal torture would inevitably force the proudest men to willingly confess to being Japanese spies, fascist German saboteurs, or even plotting the most absurd assassinations. His absolute ultimate cruelty lay within the disgusting, highly orchestrated public show trials. The battered victims were forced to wear baggy, ill-fitting clothes, violently trembling as they stood before the mock court, mechanically regurgitating entirely fabricated confessions they had been beaten into memorizing, using hoarse, broken voices. Stalin secretly sat hidden behind a dark, heavy velvet curtain in the upper balcony, smirking with extreme sadistic glee as he closely watched his former comrades publicly destroy their own honor and pathetically cry for a completely fake leniency. He aggressively forced them to sign confessions stained heavily with the hot tears and sweat of their own families. His solemn promise to spare their wives and children was a sickening, bald-faced lie. The absolute second the dry, metallic crack of a revolver violently echoed in the execution cellar, blasting the prisoner's skull wide open, their entire family was instantly violently herded into freezing cattle cars and banished straight to the deadly ice-covered Gulag concentration camps in Siberia. He brutally exterminated 1,000 human souls every single day. The nauseating, burning stench from the massive crematoriums operating at maximum capacity day and night completely blanketed the outskirts of Moscow, forming thick, dark clouds of concentrated evil. Stalin perfectly manipulated the entire psychological perception of a massive nation, successfully making victims violently scream "Thank you, Comrade Stalin, right before the executioner's bullet violently tore through the back of their necks. It was an incredibly demonic art of dark manipulation, violently molding millions of flesh-and-blood humans into hollow, terrified puppets who knew absolutely nothing but blind obedience wrapped in inescapable, suffocating horror. For a colossal slaughterhouse to operate flawlessly, the apex monster absolutely needs the most cold-blooded butchers, and Stalin effectively found two incredibly bloodthirsty demons wearing human skin, Nikolai Yezhov and Lavrentiy Beria. These monsters were not merely completely devoted henchmen, they were the terrifying, brutal physical extensions of Stalin's very own hands, fiercely loyal attack dogs eagerly barking and violently ripping apart anyone their master simply pointed his finger at. Nikolai Yezhov, terrifyingly dubbed the bloodthirsty dwarf, stood at barely 1.5 meters tall, yet his terrifyingly dark, deadly shadow completely blanketed the entire Soviet Union. Hidden tightly behind a bland, superficially friendly smile and a pathetic, stunted physical frame was a deeply vicious predator entirely intoxicated by the heavy stench of fresh blood and ear-piercing screams of agony. Yezhov was the exact architect who successfully weaponized the Great Terror into a highly mechanized industrial meat grinder. He sadistically established rigid execution quotas for every single geographic region, operating exactly like setting forced production targets for mining coal or forging steel. Local secret police squads violently competed against each other to arrest the highest volume of enemies of the people, any lazy unit that failed to violently drag in the required human quota was brutally hurled into the execution chambers by Yezhov himself to make up the missing numbers. Yezhov's heavy, black leather trench coat constantly reeked of the disgusting, metallic stench of fresh blood and terrified urine. He took extreme sadistic pleasure in personally torturing the helpless victims, violently using the heavy, steel-reinforced tips of his leather boots to aggressively shatter the front teeth of arrogant intellectuals, laughing in a high-pitched, demonic shriek as he watched hot blood and jagged tooth splinters violently spray from their ruptured mouths. But the absolute second this blood-soaked hunting dog had violently ripped off enough flesh to satisfy the state, Stalin coldly discarded him like a filthy, bloody rag. Yezhov was violently dragged down into the exact same execution basement he had proudly designed, his bones ruthlessly smashed to pieces. He pathetically cried and desperately begged for forgiveness before a heavy bullet violently tore through his eardrum, instantly terminating his deeply disgusting, miserable existence. Instantly stepping into the bloody void left by Yezhov was Lavrenti Beria, an educated, highly intelligent demon who was terrifyingly infinitely more sadistic and fundamentally sick. Beria constantly wore round intellectual spectacles, his deeply greasy, obese face forever plastered with a deeply sinister, predatory smile exactly like a highly venomous snake patiently waiting to strike. If Yezhov was a crude, filthy butcher frantically hacking away blindly with a heavy meat cleaver, Beria was a highly refined psychopath wielding a microscopic scalpel, slowly and sadistically slicing directly into the central nervous system of his victims. Beria did not merely hunger for the absolute power of life and death, he possessed a deeply sickening, insatiable appetite for raw flesh. Gliding slowly through the dark streets of Moscow in his pitch-black, heavily armored limousine, the brutal rapist's predatory eyes aggressively scanned the sidewalks for beautiful young women. His heavily armed goons would instantly violently kidnap them off the streets, forcefully dragging them directly into his private mansion, a dark hellhole suffocating with the thick stench of expensive wine and extreme sexual violence. Their desperate, blood-curdling screams were completely swallowed by the incredibly thick, soundproofed stone walls. Dozens of innocent girls were ruthlessly, savagely raped by him, violently strangled to death with thick ropes, and then secretly buried directly underneath the brilliantly blooming rose bushes in his private courtyard. Stalin intimately knew every single disgusting, depraved detail of Beria's sickening behavior. But to the man of steel, a completely immoral, cold-blooded sexual sadist was the absolutely perfect tool. He once smiled with deep pride, aggressively patting Beria on his broad shoulder, actively introducing him to visiting foreign officials by boasting "This is our Himmler, Stalin's immense cruelty could not physically pull the execution trigger millions of times by itself. He desperately required deeply sick, twisted monsters exactly like Yezhov and Beria to successfully transform his most insanely sadistic torture fantasies into a bloody, tangible reality. They violently latched onto Stalin's immense power exactly like massive, bloated leeches sucking the nation dry of blood, yet they remained forever nothing more than cheap, highly disposable black pawns heavily maneuvering on the great dictator's corpse-covered chessboard. They arrogantly believed they were entirely controlling the Grim Reaper's scythe, remaining completely blind to the terrifying reality that Stalin had already loosely tied a blood-soaked noose directly around their thick necks from the very first day. When the colossal, terrifying war machine of Nazi Germany aggressively tore the non-aggression pact to shreds, violently stomping across the borders and surging deep into Soviet territory, Stalin's deeply ingrained paranoia violently erupted into an incredibly brutal, unprecedented madness. He aggressively locked himself deep inside his fortified underground bunker, furiously roaring with rage as he watched millions of completely unprepared Red Army soldiers be brutally slaughtered or frantically surrender. But instead of physically accepting the catastrophic reality that he had already personally purged and murdered all of his most brilliant military generals back in 1937, Stalin actively blamed this crushing defeat on sheer cowardice and widespread betrayal. To him, the fresh blood of his soldiers was merely an incredibly cheap, highly disposable liquid fuel explicitly meant to be violently hurled into the raging furnace of total war. He aggressively issued the highly infamous Order No. 227, brutally titled "Not One Step Back, This was absolutely never an inspiring, heroic rallying cry, it was a deeply ruthless, collective death warrant aimed directly at the exposed backs of his own terrified troops fighting on the front lines. On the fiercely blazing, hellish battlefields utterly choked with freezing mud and brutally torn intestines, Soviet soldiers were not merely forced to confront the thunderous, flesh-shredding machine gun fire of the German Nazis directly in front of them. They concurrently had to face the terrifyingly cold, pitch-black barrels of weapons aggressively aimed squarely at the back of their own necks from behind. Stalin strategically deployed ruthless NKVD blocking detachments, deeply cold-blooded, emotionless killing machines devoid of any human empathy, to strictly establish highly lethal execution barriers positioned directly behind the active front lines. Their absolute sole objective was not to shoot the invading enemy, but to violently unleash heavy machine gun fire to instantly exterminate any terrified Red Army soldier who dared to turn around in sheer panic, or who even took a single step backward to frantically bandage a violently spurting, bleeding wound. The battlefield rapidly mutated into an unimaginably horrific, double-sided human slaughterhouse. Starving, completely terrified young boys, often violently forced to charge carrying rusted, empty rifles, aggressively surged directly into intense storms of heavy German lead, acting as incredibly fragile, shattering meat shields. When they became utterly paralyzed by extreme fear from the massive artillery firestorms violently incinerating human flesh, they desperately attempted to crawl backward into the muddy, freezing trenches, crying and begging for reinforcements. But aggressively waiting to welcome them was not the warm embrace of supportive comrades, but the highly merciless, deafening roar of NKVD Maxim machine guns aggressively spitting hot lead. Thousands of terrified Russian boys were violently gunned down, their spines ruthlessly snapped in half, their skulls violently blasted wide open, their bones completely pulverized by heavy bullets manufactured entirely by their very own homeland. Their mutilated, broken corpses aggressively piled on top of each other to violently form massive, slimy hills of heavily bleeding meat, completely submerged in thick, freezing mud heavily mixed with violently torn intestines and scattered brain matter. Stalin's intensely sickening paranoia extended its extremely slimy, venomous tentacles so deep that he formally declared absolutely any soldier captured as a prisoner of war by the Germans to be an irredeemable, disgusting traitor. When his very own biological son, Yakov, was violently captured by German forces, and the Nazis formally proposed a direct prisoner exchange for a captured German field marshal, Stalin coldly sneered, violently growling / "I will not trade a field marshal for a miserable private / he completely abandoned his own flesh and blood, violently throwing him to the vicious fascist wolves to be aggressively torn apart. Even those incredibly unfortunate Soviet soldiers who miraculously survived the absolute hell of German concentration camps, dragging their deeply diseased, heavily scarred bodies back to their homeland, were instantly violently shackled by Stalin's secret police. They were aggressively hurled directly into freezing, filthy cattle cars and violently banished straight to the deadly Gulag camps in Siberia to violently freeze to death. For Stalin, absolute loyalty simply did not exist. The absolutely only human being incapable of treason was a completely stiff, freezing corpse that could no longer open its mouth. The incredibly glorious Soviet victory in World War II was, in brutal reality, physically constructed entirely upon a colossal, blood-soaked mountain of shattered human corpses that Stalin himself had ruthlessly violently shoved into the mechanized meat grinder from both sides of the firing line. During the violently degrading final years of his brutal existence, the terrifying monster ruling inside the Kremlin was no longer the completely invincible man of steel. He had violently degraded into a paranoid, heavily withered old man, slowly drowning in an unimaginably colossal, pitch-black swamp of absolute paranoia he had personally created. The thick, suffocating darkness of extreme, sadistic suspicion had completely and utterly swallowed Stalin's decaying mind. He would desperately wander the dead, silent corridors of the Kuntsevo dacha deep in the middle of the night, his deeply bloodshot eyes aggressively bulging out as he frantically glared into dark corners. He constantly hallucinated that elite, highly trained assassins armed with heavily poisoned daggers were violently lurking directly behind the thick, heavy velvet curtains. He was deathly terrified of absolutely everything. Terrified that his luxurious food was laced with deadly strychnine, terrified of lights that burned too brightly, and most profoundly terrified of the very medical professionals who had successfully treated his ailing flesh. This extreme final descent into absolute madness violently erupted into the deeply infamous / doctor's plot / his completely shattered, paranoid mind genuinely convinced him that the most incredibly devoted Jewish doctors were actively, maliciously conspiring to violently shred the internal organs of the top Soviet leadership by secretly prescribing highly lethal medications. Once again, bone-chilling, throat-tearing screams of unimaginable agony violently echoed deep within the blood-soaked, freezing torture basements of the Lubyanka. The ruthless secret police executioners enthusiastically utilized heavy steel pliers to aggressively shatter the delicate fingers of doctors who had dedicated their lives to saving others, violently forcing them to confess to absurd, entirely fabricated atrocities just to temporarily satisfy the dying dictator's final, pathetic thirst for fresh blood. But the most intensely ruthless, brutal law of karma always meticulously selects the absolute perfect moment to violently drop the final curtain. By ruthlessly slaughtering, torturing, and imprisoning absolutely all of the most highly skilled medical experts, Stalin had explicitly used his very own bloody hands to dig a bottomless, inescapable grave for himself. On a brutally freezing winter night in early March 1953, the apex demon was finally violently struck down. A devastatingly massive stroke slammed directly into his fragile brain exactly like a colossal, heavy sledgehammer, violently rupturing his delicate cerebral blood vessels. The terrifying supreme leader, the absolute god who had brutally manipulated the fragile lives of hundreds of millions of people with a single, casual flick of his hand, now violently collapsed directly onto the freezing wool carpet. He convulsed and frantically thrashed around pathetically, soaking heavily in a rapidly expanding pool of his very own warm urine and deeply reeking, foul vomit. His mouth aggressively foamed with thick, dark fluids, his heavily bloodshot eyes violently rolled backward into his skull, and his throat emitted extremely pathetic, choking gurgles, sounding exactly like a desperately trapped, wounded animal violently shattering its own teeth in a completely useless panic. Just inches outside the heavily locked, thick oak door, his heavily armed personal guard stood entirely paralyzed, frozen exactly like stiff stone statues while cold sweat aggressively poured down their trembling spines. The absolutely rigid, terrifying iron discipline entirely forged through decades of immense bloodshed and mind-shattering horror had firmly nailed their combat boots directly to the wooden floor. He had explicitly issued absolute, strict orders that no living human was permitted to disturb his sleep, and the highly standard penalty for even slight disobedience was having one's brain matter instantly and violently splattered across the brick walls. The absolute, suffocating terror he had spent a bloody lifetime brutally cultivating had finally aggressively returned to tightly strangle his own dying, gasping throat. He lay completely helpless, convulsing on the filthy floor, desperately inhaling the highly putrid, foul air heavily generated by his very own rapidly failing, decaying flesh, agonizingly waiting for a slow, agonizing death to sadistically chew away at every single remaining neuron in absolute, terrifying isolation. Not a single guard actively dared to call for medical assistance, primarily because absolutely all the most capable, intelligent doctors had already been brutally tortured to death or were currently securely locked in freezing dungeons with rusty iron shackles clamped tightly around their necks. Stalin had explicitly used extreme, terrifying paranoia and oceans of fresh blood to entirely dominate the vast world, and in the bitter end, he violently choked to death in his own piss, completely drowning at the very bottom of the exact same horrifying, pitch-black abyss he had spent his entire life brutally digging. The suffocating stench of warm urine violently wafted up from the heavy wool rug glued to the swollen, paralyzed body of the 74-year-old dictator. Inside the claustrophobic bedroom of the Kuntsevo dacha, Ioseb Jugashvili now lay entirely helpless in a foul pool of his own stomach bile on the freezing floor. A brutal stroke had just violently torn through the blood vessels in his brain, completely stripping him of all physical movement. His mouth aggressively foamed with thick saliva mixed with coagulated black blood, while his fat, stubby fingers desperately clawed at the carpet threads until the fingernails violently ripped completely off. A sickening, wheezing death rattle, resembling a slaughtered pig choking on its own blood, escaped his bone-dry throat. Just outside the thick, heavy oak door, dozens of heavily armed military guards stood absolutely frozen in pure terror, cold sweat dripping down their pale faces. The extreme, paralyzing fear forged by decades of bloody executions had finally returned to violently strangle him. The guards would much rather let their supreme leader drown in a miserable puddle of his own piss than step inside and risk getting their skulls instantly blasted open. He lay there, convulsing in his own filthy human waste for over 12 agonizing hours. When bloodthirsty subordinates like Lavrenti Beria finally kicked the oak doors open, they did not bring a single ounce of human pity. Beria coldly glared at the convulsing, dying monster, curled his lips into a deeply sadistic smirk. He ruthlessly stomped his heavy military boots directly through his master's reeking vomit puddle, marching straight to the heavy oak desk. The dictator's final wheezing gasp abruptly ceased. His eyes bulged wide open, the blood vessels completely ruptured and bleeding into the scara. Beria did not bother to glance at the corpse for a single second. He violently snatched a stack of unsigned execution lists from the desk, coldly shoving the death-soaked papers directly into his waistband. His heavy leather boots squelched loudly against the urine-soaked carpet as he turned his back, entirely abandoning the bloated, freezing meat sack in the center of the room. Through the slightly ajar window, a swarm of fat green blowflies aggressively buzzed inside, frantically swarming before landing directly onto the ruptured, blood-filled eyeballs of the man who had devoured millions of souls, eagerly beginning to lay their eggs directly onto his rapidly clouding corneas.